Recording in progress.
Okay, welcome to the December 12th, 2024 Planning Commission hearing. I will call the hearing to order at 1:01 p.m. Ms. Esparza, can we have a roll call vote?
Thank you, Chair Bauke. I'll take the roll call. Chair Bauke?
Here.
Vice Chair Wardlow?
Here.
Commissioner Barnwell?
Here.
Commissioner Boss?
Present.
Commissioner DeLuccio?
Here.
Commissioner Lodge is absent, and Commissioner Wiscombe.
Here.
We have a quorum. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to preliminary matters, we have Mr. Busk here. Thank you for attending. Do we have any requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or additions to exigent items today?
Thank you, Chair Bauke. We have none.
Okay. Do we have any announcements or appeals?
I did want to mention that on Tuesday, the City Council heard the appeal of the 17 through 21 West Montecito Hotel project, and they denied the appeal, thereby upholding the project and the Planning Commission's conditions of approval and findings.
Okay, thank you. And we have no minutes or resolutions for this meeting, so we're going to move right on to public comments pertaining to items not on the agenda. Do we have any speaker slips for that or folks online?
Thank you, Chair Bauke. Currently, we do not have any virtual participants, and I don't have any speaker slips for general business. If there's anyone in the audience who wanted to speak on general business, that's items not on today's agenda, please come up to the podium.
Okay.
Not seeing any movement, so I'll turn it back to you.
With that, we'll close the general public comment and move on to our next item, which is a discussion item, which is the adaptive reuse ordinance. It's a discussion before the Planning Commission to facilitate the draft adaptive reuse ordinance, and we probably have a lot of questions on this. Mr. Gullett, are you going to present, or is Ms. Falk going to be the presenter?
Ms. Falk will be presenting. I would like to introduce it just very briefly, if that's okay with the
Okay,
chair.
you can do that.
So we're here today to get your feedback on the draft adaptive reuse ordinance before completing environmental review on it and returning for a recommendation from Planning Commission to Council. This ordinance would implement one of the 32 programs identified in the 2023 to 2031 housing element, rebalancing the use of existing buildings by facilitating conversion to housing has been recognized to increase housing supply and potentially decrease housing demand by the workforce as office space and other commercial spaces are reduced. Geographically, the housing element program is focused on the central business district since it has the most potential for conversion of larger buildings and is the best place for high-density housing due to the mix of uses, transportation options, jobs, and ample public open space. And I just wanted to stress to the Planning Commission, as Ms. Falk will say, the adaptive reuse ordinance would not remove the existing change in use process that would still be available outside the uses and areas identified for adaptive reuse. Also, we're evaluating inclusionary housing requirements, has been mentioned before. That's another housing element program. There's an in-progress feasibility study. We're expecting a draft early next year, as soon as February, for review, and that will come to Planning Commission when the Planning Commission draft is ready. And any changes to inclusionary housing requirements citywide will be informed by this study, so that's not under discussion today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Dana Falk. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, Planning Commissioners. My name is Dana Falk. I'm a project planner in Long Range and Special Studies. Today, I'm going to be presenting on the draft adaptive reuse ordinance to implement that first housing element program. The recommendation today is a discussion item, and that Planning
Madam
Commission.
Clerk, we have no video on any of the laptops up here, so maybe there's a switch that needs to be thrown. Sorry, we didn't see her.
No rush. It's only a few
No
slides.
presentation for us, and it's easier to look at the screen, honestly.
Chair Bach, do you mind if we move for a brief recess while I
Sure.
call Study TV? Thank you so much.
Before we got into it, better do this now. Thank you. We'll take a momentary break. All right. Sorry for the delay from all these lovely technical issues. We're back to where we were at the start, but we tried to fix it. So, Mr. Gullett, would you please start your summary and introduction, and then we can move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Bauke. Again, this may be Groundhog Day to some of the viewing public, but we're pleased to be here today to get your feedback on the draft adaptive reuse ordinance before we complete environmental review on it. After we do that, we'll return to Planning Commission for a recommendation to City Council. So this ordinance would implement one of the 32 programs, HE1, of the 2023 to 2031 housing element. Rebalancing the use of existing buildings by facilitating conversion to housing can increase housing supply and potentially decrease housing demand by the workforce as office space and other commercial spaces are reduced. Geographically, the housing element program says it's focused initially on the central business district. Central Business District has the most potential for conversion, and it's the best place for high-density housing due to the mix of uses. There's jobs, transportation options, ample public open space, and other services available downtown. I want to stress that the adaptive reuse ordinance would not remove the existing change in use process, so that's available citywide. Ms. Falk will be addressing that in her presentation some. Also, we're working at the same time on the inclusionary housing program. Those requirements are being evaluated by our consultant currently. The feasibility study we expect to be available to the public and the Planning Commission early next year. We expect an administrative draft January or February. Any changes to inclusionary housing citywide will be informed by that study. We're not proposing any changes as part of the adaptive reuse program at this time. That concludes my comments. Project planner Dana Falk will be providing the staff presentation on the adaptive reuse ordinance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Bauke and Planning Commissioners. Dana Falk, Project Planner with Long Range and Special Studies. I'm going to be sharing with you the draft adaptive reuse ordinance to implement housing element program number 1. So today, this is a discussion item, and staff's recommendation is that Planning Commission receive this presentation, receive public comment, hold a discussion, and provide feedback to staff. To start our discussion, I'm going to quickly go over some background that influenced the draft adaptive reuse ordinance in front of you today, and a majority of this information was covered at the July 2024 joint work session that you had with City Council. Like I mentioned, as did Dan, this is housing element program number 1 to facilitate conversion of non-residential buildings to housing. This is focused within the Central Business District and on historic resources, and it is the first of the 32 programs in the housing element and one of many that staff is working on at present. Adaptive reuse has become more attractive nationwide in light of recent commercial vacancy rates and the need for housing. The proposed definition for adaptive reuse in Title 30 is the retrofitting and repurposing of an existing building to create new residential units. See also change in use. Change in use is a current city planning process that allows any building to convert to any other use that's allowed in that zone. The definition in Title 30 is shown on the screen here. An adaptive reuse ordinance would not remove this change in use process. Projects could still come in and use it to convert from one use to another in the zone. I just want to make it really clear that the ordinance that we are talking about today would not remove this process in any capacity. A little bit more about change in use. It is enabled by the city's pyramid zoning scheme, and this means that many of the non-residential zones allow multi-unit residential within them. So a building could change from a non-residential use to another non-residential use, or a non-residential use to a residential use, or residential to a non-residential. There's multiple variations of this, and the complexity of a change in use project would vary dependent on the kind of use transitions that they're going through. The development standards that these projects must meet do depend on the use that they're proposing. So some projects may require relief from development standards when transitioning to a new use. And there are a couple different mechanisms that a project can request this relief, either through a zoning modification or by a concession available under the state density bonus program. And again, reiterating, change in use is not going away when we're talking about the draft adaptive reuse ordinance. When we are looking at crafting this ordinance, we did a lot of community outreach. Some of it was through public hearings, such as this one, and that began back in November of 2021. Planning Commission received a conceptual draft ordinance on adaptive reuse as a larger multi-unit residential package that was a discussion item. As I mentioned, we had a joint work session with City Council and Planning Commission back in July of this year, where we talked about this Housing Element Program number 1, as well as Housing Element Program 20. Since that meeting with you all, we've had 6 focus group interviews. 4 of those were with internal staff. 2 of them were with external groups, as well as an additional follow-on meeting just this past Monday with one of those previous focus groups. And then today, we're here talking to you again. We've also looked at past projects that have done change in use to create residential units, and that was part of all this process as we're doing research to inform the ordinance today. I'm going to go really quickly through some of the feedback that we received here, and then as I talk through the draft ordinance a little bit later in this presentation, I'll explain how this input changed what we're proposing. So back in 2021, the Planning Commission draft ordinance that they saw included the Central Business District, historic resources, had to use existing buildings, and those buildings needed to be 20 years old. The incentives that were proposed focused on density, open yard, and vehicle parking. At that meeting, most of the comments were incredibly supportive of the ordinance concepts, as well as discussion on some of the incentives and requirements that were presented, including the ground floor commercial requirement and parking requirements, as well as a discussion, much like we've been having more recently, about the impact of other city regulations on these types of projects. From the commissioners, we also heard support, as well as some recommendations on refinements of the ordinance, including the building age, open yard requirements, and that ground floor commercial requirement. When we discussed this topic in 2024, staff had proposed that applicability for adaptive reuse projects be expanded a little bit, keeping the Central Business District focus, as well as the historic resources from the previous conceptual ordinance, as well as allowing 100% affordable low-income projects and existing hotels to be considered as an applicable project category. The incentives remained the same for density, open yard, and parking when we chatted earlier this year. From the public, we heard generally supportive comments, a call for increased flexibility, and the impact of some other city regulations, including water meter requirements, SWIMP stormwater management plan, the building code, as well as inclusionary housing requirements. From City Council and Planning Commission, you guys are also supportive, with ordinance refinements focusing on ground floor commercial, inclusionary housing, the allowance for additional floor area, building age, and then again, the impact of other city regulations that would have on these projects. Like I mentioned, we did conduct targeted community engagement over the last few months, and that was with the AIA Advocacy Committee, as well as a small group of applicants that had completed or are in the process of completing change in use projects that are creating residential units. And those internal focus group interviews were held with the different divisions and departments of the city regulations that we'd heard in the past public hearings. That included building and safety staff, transportation planning staff, water distribution staff, and creeks staff. So with that, I'm gonna switch over to talking about what the draft ordinance includes, and again, tying it back to what we've heard as we're going through this. So the adaptive reuse ordinance purpose is to incentivize the creation of housing, reuse existing non-residential buildings, codify commonly approved zoning modifications, and that in essence will reduce some of the planning process these projects will need to go through. There are 4 applicability categories that staff is proposing for this ordinance. A project must meet one of them. This is an or list, not an and list. So if a project is within the central business district, that's an applicable category. If it's a historic resource anywhere in the city, applicable. If it's a hotel anywhere in the city, applicable. And if the project is proposing that the new development will have 50% of those new units affordable to moderate, low, or very low, also applicable. I'll go into these a little bit more detail. For the central business district, it would be the non-residential buildings located here. And this corresponds to multiple city initiatives, including the State Street Master Plan area, as well as many general plan policies and goals. Staff has heard from the public as well as commission and council about expanding this area, and we did a pretty extensive analysis, which Dan mentioned in his introduction, about why this is the appropriate area to focus this applicability category in the adaptive reuse ordinance. Housing is a vital component to creating a really active and vibrant downtown, economically sound. You need to have housing there. And so we are looking to create an incentive to put housing where it is most appropriate to place it. This map just shows the boundaries of the central business district. North is oriented to the left. Just to give you a little bit more context, it extends from Highway 101 at the south, along Garden Street on the east, with the peak at Arriaga, and the western boundary more or less along De La Vina. The second applicability category that we propose for the adaptive reuse ordinance is for non-residential historic resources. This isn't to align with a state law that was passed in the last few years. We're actually planning to exceed the minimums that state law requires and offer a little bit more to try and incentivize historic resources converting into housing. And this will prolong the life of those buildings as well, because they'll be rejuvenated with a new use. The third applicability category is for hotels or similar uses. This responds to community concerns as well as aligns with Housing Element Program HE20. And again, it rejuvenates some of these existing facilities with a new use and creates more housing for residents. And the final applicability category that staff proposes in the adaptive reuse ordinance is for 50% affordable units that's deed restricted for moderate, low, or very low income households. Again, this is informed by a state law, but we are exceeding that. This was directly related to a discussion that we heard back in July from all of you, and it's to incentivize the affordable housing creation in these existing buildings where we can. In addition to the applicability category, an adaptive reuse project must meet all 7 of these eligibility criteria. So the first is the project must be proposing new residential units. This focuses the incentives in this ordinance on the creation of housing, and it requires a minimum of 1 unit in order to be eligible. The second is the existing building must be at least 10 years old. This is to prioritize the reuse of older buildings, and it does change from the previous draft conceptual ordinance in 2021 by reducing the building age in half. It used to be 20 years that staff was proposing, but in light of comments that we've heard, we've reduced this to a 10-year building age minimum. As part of adaptive reuse, it must be within the existing building envelope. This helps to maintain the existing architectural character of the structure, as well as correlating to some of the incentives, especially about the density maximums being removed, so that you are still controlling what the building is able to create by restraining it to the existing building envelope. A project must be within a zone that allows multi-unit residential. Again, our pyramid zoning is pretty permissive, and multi-unit residential is allowed in all but 2 of the non-residential zones across the city. The only 2 you could not do this in would be the manufacturing industrial, MI, and then parks and recreation, the PR zones. We do want to prioritize mixed-use developments as well, so a project does not have to be solely residential. It can have other non-residential uses within it, with the exception of no creation of a new hotel or similar use, and industrial uses cannot be relocated, expanded or removed, and this aligns with some general plan policies to protect manufacturing and industrial uses in land. We're in the home stretch of eligibility criteria here. Open space must be maintained on an adaptive reuse project, and this is to retain a quality of life amenities on those sites. This includes landscaped areas, trees, or other open spaces, and does correlate to an incentive, since we are looking to try and create these buildings with the least friction in the new development standards for residential use. Maintaining open space does make sure that those residential units do have access to some quality of life amenities. And the final eligibility criteria is automobile parking that's existing on site must be maintained. This is to, again, a quality of life, retain mobility options for those residents, and it does correlate to an incentive as well. So I've mentioned these a few times, incentives, and I'm going to go through them really quickly. The first incentive is that there's no maximum residential density for eligible adaptive reuse projects. So if a project meets one of the applicability categories we went through and meets all of the eligibility criteria, they get this incentive by right. This incentive is geared towards the full reutilization of that building without requirements for the density maximums of the zone. And for current change in use process, a project can only do as many units that the zone allows, no matter how much space they may have within that existing building envelope. Of course, you can exceed density maximums with state density bonus law. There are, of course, affordability requirements tied to that. So we're looking to incentivize full reuse of buildings by removing density maximums for eligible adaptive reuse projects. And I want to read from the staff report a statement that I think will explain a little bit more clearly how this and some of the eligibility requirements work together. So while the idea of unlimited residential density might seem overwhelming, it's crucial to understand that adaptive reuse projects are confined to the physical limits of existing structures. This means that while the interior use might change, the overall size and footprint of the building remain the same. And a little bit further on page 8 is, in effect, density is regulated by the existing building envelope and a project's creative design of the building interior, rather than a zone's maximum density. And this incentive remains the same from the 2021 conceptual ordinance that was presented. The second incentive is no setback requirements for the conversion, and it responds to the eligibility criteria requiring the reuse of an existing building. Like I mentioned, development standards do differ depending on the use, and setbacks is one of those. Residential uses typically have larger setback requirements, and so reusing an existing building that was not built to residential setbacks does require some relief, and that's what this incentive is for. The third incentive is no additional automobile parking is required. Much like setbacks, parking ratios do differ based on the use, and since we are requiring the reuse of an existing building, there just may not be space on site to meet the parking ratios that are required for this new use. The locational focus of adaptive reuse, the geographic area of the central business district, was also pretty critical in this incentive because it aligns with areas of reduced or no parking requirements, either from local ordinances or from state law. So this area is also highly walkable, bikeable, and there's a high transit access, so parking in this area has been deemed not as critical across other ordinance and policies in the city. So we are aligning with state legislation that removes parking for adaptive reuse for historic structures, as well as extremely affordable adaptive reuse projects. In fact, we're going beyond what the the state minimums require, because we are allowing more projects to be eligible for this incentive than would be allowed under state law alone. The 2021 conceptual ordinance did include this incentive as well. And when we were looking at some example change in use projects to inform the incentives and the requirements of this ordinance, all but one, and there were 9 projects researched, all but one of them used a zoning modification or a state density bonus concession to modify the parking requirements. So that supported this incentive from staff. And ultimately, by allowing no additional automobile parking, we are incentivizing space for people over space for cars in these projects. The final incentive for eligible adaptive reuse projects is no additional open space is required. Like I said, development standards for residential differ. Only residential uses must provide open yard for residents. That's not something you're going to find in an existing non-residential building. And so correlating with that eligibility requirement of maintaining open space, there is no additional open space required for these projects. And again, looking at those past project examples, two did not use anything to modify open space. So 7 of 9 did modify open space requirements. Again, zoning modification or concession from state density bonus law. Okay, we're home stretch. So there are a few additional requirements that we're proposing in the adaptive reuse, and you must meet all of them. So I'm not going to talk through every single one in the ordinance. I'm just going to go through the 5 on the screen here. As Dan mentioned, inclusionary housing is not being modified by this adaptive reuse ordinance. An adaptive reuse project must comply with the existing city regulations for inclusionary housing. Ownership requirements are found in Chapter 30.160 and rental in Section 30.150.110. Staff is working on a feasibility study that's evaluating inclusionary housing on a citywide scale, and any amendments to inclusionary housing requirements would be done, again, at citywide, which then would impact adaptive reuse projects at that time. So at this time, no change to inclusionary housing is included in the adaptive reuse ordinance. Unit size minimums and maximums are being revised within the adaptive reuse ordinance, and this works in conjunction with the eligibility requirement to reuse within the existing building envelope, as well as the incentive of unlimited density for these projects. Much like AUD projects can have a maximum average unit size, whereas the minimum unit size is a bare minimum set by Section 30.140.150. For studios, it must be at least 220 square feet, and if any unit has 1 or more bedrooms, it must be a minimum of 400 square feet. The third additional requirement I'm going to talk through today is limits on new floor area. This was not something included in the 2021 conceptual draft ordinance, but it is something that we did hear about at the joint meeting this past July. Staff proposes an allowance with limits for new floor area for adaptive reuse projects. This floor area must be used for circulation, egress, or as necessary for building code requirements, or up to 250 square feet for a residential amenity that is open to all residential tenants. Staff considered many iterations of this requirement for additional floor area, but is cautioning restraint in allowing this to be less precise, although that can be changed. We did do a lot of study on what kind of spaces and what kind of things may need to go outside of a building to make it more feasible. The required ground floor non-residential space is only required for buildings that front onto State Street from Montecito Street down Highway 101 north up to Sola Street. This aligns with the State Street master plan area, and this is to activate the pedestrian level facade along State Street. This requirement originated in the 2021 conceptual draft ordinance, and through public comment and discussion at past public hearings, staff revised the requirement to more closely align with other city initiatives, as well as to augment the required amount of ground floor commercial in these buildings. Just for reference, State Street here is shown on the white line, all the area that this would require, only for buildings that front on State Street. And the last additional requirement I'm going to walk through in the presentation today is bicycle parking. Unlike the incentive for no automobile parking, bicycle parking would have to be provided at the existing city ratios, which is found in Chapter 30.175. And the final topic I'm going to talk through today from the ordinance is the review process. Planning review would be through the typical process as it exists today, with one exception. The requirement for pre-application and concept review would be waived for eligible adaptive reuse projects. In addition, if a project meets an applicability category as well as all of the eligibility requirements, they would not need a zoning modification or using a concession from state density bonus to get the incentives that staff is proposing for parking open yard density and that setback of conversions. In essence, this should lower the fees and reduce the permitting durations for these projects because they won't have to go through that additional review process for the modifications. And in closing, I'm going to cover the next steps for this draft adaptive reuse ordinance. So today we're doing a discussion item, and we will come back to you at least once more for hearing number 1, Planning Commission recommend, as well as 3 additional hearings with City Council because this is an ordinance amendment. It's a 4-hearing minimum. So you will see this again. We don't know exactly when in 2025 we're coming back to you, but we will be coming back in 2025 to complete this HE1 program by the timeline in the housing element, which is December 2025 to complete. So with that, I'm going to remind you of the recommendation for today's agenda item and say thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Falk, for your presentation. Let's move on to public comment on this item. Do we have any speaker slips or folks online who would like to speak?
Thank you, Chair Bauke. I do have 3 speaker slips already. If there's anyone else in the audience who'd like to speak on the item, please fill out a slip and turn it in. First up, we have Carl Hutter, followed by Ben Romo. Mr. Hutter, if you mind coming up to the podium, and then you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Welcome.
Chair Bauke, Commissioners. My name is Carl Hutterer, and I'm speaking on my behalf and on behalf of Dennis Allen, my colleague. We are members of a CEC team who developed and proposed an ecological framework for the revitalization of our downtown core. Obviously, adaptive use is a very, very essential part of an ecological model for developing urban space. We want to recommend city staff and all the people who worked on this quite extensive process on developing the draft ordinance. And I want to say that we think that the draft ordinance as it now stands is really excellent. It is comprehensive, it's thoughtful, it's feasible, and I think it is needed. So we want to recommend that this draft ordinance be adopted. Obviously, it will go through some more steps, but we would love to see it enacted pretty much in the way it is. There are some elements in the in the ordinance that could be a little bit more aggressive. For instance, with regard to parking issues, with regard to adding additional space to the existing footprint of buildings and so forth. But overall, it is, I think, an excellent piece of work, and we thank you for it, and we hope that it will be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you. Next, we have Ben Romo, followed by Brian Kernall.
Hi, thank you. I think I've shared in the past, spoken at your hearing that you had on July 26th, and appreciate very much the work that the city and the city staff is doing on this. I am a bit disappointed in a few things that I think are just glaringly missing and I think ignored in the current proposal. Number one, I think the adaptive reuse policy should apply beyond the central business district. A straw poll was taken at the July 26th hearing. It was 11-2 of commissioners and council members saying that they would like, that you all would like it to apply in the city's AUD program area and in the priority housing overlay. I've worked for a government body before. When I see my elected representatives or appointed representatives voting 11-2 on something, I take that as direction to staff to go that direction. And I don't know why that's missing now. I do understand that parking is a concern outside of the central business district, but in reality, most commercial buildings have parking outside of the central business district and can utilize that. I don't think that's a legitimate concern, and it's a housing crisis. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. A big one for us, and this is something that this is really our major concern, is the continuing to apply the inclusionary ordinance in the central business district. The inclusionary ordinance is a huge hurdle to doing housing downtown. Downtown housing, doing these conversions downtown, we've done one, we're doing a second one now. Doing these conversions downtown is extremely complex. There's a lot of risk. Not every building, many buildings, I might say most buildings, aren't technically, legally even qualified as candidates for conversions due to fire safety issues and other constraints. Also, property owners, philosophically, there are a lot of property owners that simply will not accept a 90-year relationship with the government in one of their housing units. The cost of the inclusionary units is a deal killer for a lot of projects. So when you look at downtown, where we have the double whammy of potential impact here of housing to address the housing crisis and economic development to revitalize downtown, we need to eliminate every hurdle possible in order to make those projects happen. It used to be that developers would come hat in hand to the city and beg to do development. The tables have turned. The city needs to recognize that. You need housing providers. Our community needs housing providers to do projects, and it is extremely challenging. Construction costs, complexity, the risk. Why would people do it? You need to incentivize them. Additionally, my time is out, but I'm just going to say there was also a lot of questions and considerations around stormwater runoff. That's a huge issue for projects. So I think that should, I don't know why all these issues aren't being included in the draft, and I would like to see them included.
Thank you, Mr. Romo.
Thank you. Next, we have Brian Cornell. You'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Chair Balke, members of the commission. I'm going to echo a couple of Ben's comments, and I won't get into details other than as an architect, I will tell you, we're in the process of doing we've done 2 of these adaptive reuse projects. I think limiting it to the CBD, I understand why that's being done, but it makes no sense in terms of our need to increase our housing supply. If you went to the CHC conference last week, Shane Phillips talked about supply, and that is a critical component that we're missing. These projects are very difficult to undertake, and I will tell you in the CBD, the problem is most of the buildings are built property line to property line. And unless you have a specific construction type, it's very difficult to put housing in them unless you just have a unit at both ends. And it's tough and it's expensive. So I strongly encourage the expanding this area, as Ben mentioned, because we've got a lot of buildings outside of the CBD that are perfect for adaptive reuse. And that's what's going to help our community. Stormwater is another thing we've got to have relief on. One project that's being done right now is the Nordstrom building. They want to put a big hole in the middle of it so that they have light and ventilation for the units. Putting that hole in the middle of the building triggers all the stormwater requirements, and all of a sudden you create an infeasibility for the project. So that has got to be part of this. There have to be relief from the stormwater requirements. The inclusionary, I think the answer there is to allow in lieu fees for these projects instead of requiring the actual unit to be constructed, because you're going to get a lot more, I think, acceptance from people who are going to be able to do this. The bottom line, though, I was one of the speakers in the 21 hearing. I've continued to be involved in this. It's good. I'm so glad that we're finally going through this. Most of the incentives are very, very good. I just think there need to be more incentives. But most importantly, please extend beyond the CBD, because there's so much real estate that can be converted, and this needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Chair,
Cornell.
may I ask Mr. Cornell a question,
Sure.
please? Thank you. Mr. Cornell, I think you've spoken at other hearings. Did one of your projects include, my question is, can you address the ground floor requirement for for commercial? I think you, at one point, wanted that reduced from.
Well, I think what they've come up with being on State Street, I think that's perfect.
You do?
Because we really do
Okay.
need to keep State Street activated with
Okay.
commercial, so I think that's the right thing. That's what we did at the Sur La Table Building 821. We had that. And so I'm completely okay with
Okay,
that
thank you.
limitation. I do want to, though, say that on our projects, we had to do both modifications and use state bonus density in order to get the number of units that naturally fit in the building. So again, kudos to removing that obstacle. The final thing that I forgot to mention in my comments, if I may, is the flexibility on the footprint, because you're going to have situations where there's trash, there's accessibility issues. I was glad to see that that got added, and I hope it's not limited. I hope there's some reasonable flexibility there, because you never know what you have to do in order to provide trash access from inside the building, to build an elevator, for instance, that doesn't exist now. Those kind of things ought to be allowed in terms of the footprint.
Thank you.
Thank you.
May I ask him?
Barnwell thinks he has
I have
another
a question, if I may. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This idea that we're restricting everything to the footprint. Hypothetically, if the old telephone company building on Chapala Street, which has an awful lot of parking around it, all on the same lot, if that were under these restrictions, do you understand the new rules to imply that all that parking area could not be part of the project because it all has to stay within the footprint? I'm confused about requiring what you just said, the inability to add on.
Yeah. Well, I can understand how it relates to units, because obviously the incentive here is to allow as many units as you can fit in the building, and so that's the incentive, and that makes sense. So you wouldn't want to increase the footprint to allow more units, but you've got to allow the increase for stuff that happens to facilitate building code requirements. In the case of the phone building, yeah, in that case, the parking that's on that, on that lot would continue to remain, and I guess that would be a good thing. Right?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Someone
Chair.
could come back and propose something maybe later.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any online comments?
Thank you, Chair Balke. We currently do not have any virtual participants, so I'll just close with saying that written correspondence from Patricia Saley, Benny Romo, and Peter Lewis, was distributed to the commission prior to the meeting. Back to you.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the question period. Which of my fellow commissioners would like to go first? Do we have? No, Donald beat you to it. Okay. Commissioner DeLucio.
Yeah, I have tons of questions, but I won't ask that many questions, but so basically my understanding is this is only as part of, besides the CBD, it's only part of, we're talking about Title 30 right now. We're not even entering into Title 28, correct? Which would be the coastal zones.
Correct, yes. Thank you for clarifying that in your question. In the staff report, we do include a little bit more about the area that this is proposed for. It is the inland, so non-coastal zone. The Coastal Act and the local coastal program have different priorities. Residential is not one of them, and so there would need to be more analysis in order to get this in compliance and consistent with those other policies. And so at present, yes, staff is proposing inland only.
Okay, we can maybe comment on that later. And also, obviously this has a historic resources component to it. I mean, I remember early on, years ago, when we thought of adaptive reuse, we thought of historical resources. It's moved away from that. Now you're expanding on that. The question is, though, there is historic components in this. Have you presented this at all to the HRC, or have you consulted with any members of the HRC on this to get their input? HLC, I'm sorry. I can't read my own handwriting.
I have that problem as well. Commissioner DeLucio, through the chair, we have not explicitly spoken with HLC yet. It is something staff is contemplated doing. There are no changes to HLC's purview or any of the regulations that they monitor and discuss in this ordinance. And so any historic resource that is proposing to use this ordinance would still have to follow all the historic preservation or HLC requirements.
I just thought it'd be a good idea maybe to run it by them, or, and not that I'm trying to hold this back. It looks like it's been going on since 2021. And also, the other comment was, I like the streamlining of all this, but I noticed that the community director could waive like a maximum average unit sizes. How did you decide it would be the community director and not, for example, a hearing examiner?
So we're aligning with the zoning authority and the way it's structured at present. We don't have a zoning administrator, so those decisions fall to the community development director.
Okay. I just feel it's more transparent sometimes if it goes through a hearing officer. Again, I'm all about streamlining, but I am about transparency also. One other question is, I know the stormwater runoff was definitely, even in our joint session, it was discussed and commented on, and how's that going to be addressed? The runoff.
So that is something that is out of planning division. It is the creeks, and we were able to speak with a couple of different creek staff about the SWIMP requirements because we have heard from public comment that they can be prohibitively difficult to meet. When we heard from creeks, they did say that adaptive reuse projects are less likely to trigger SWIMP, and the requirements that may be triggered were tier 1 or tier 2, if I'm recalling correctly. It is something that we are in conversation with them on, but as planning staff, we don't control the SWIMP requirements. Dan?
Yeah, and Chair Bauke, Commissioner DeLuccio, we've been sharing the comments we've been hearing with sustainability and resilience staff, and they are contemplating revisiting the SWIMP program and potentially changing that to facilitate development, particularly in the central business district.
Okay, it's a very critical issue. And I said bingo when I heard in lieu of fees, perhaps putting into a housing fund instead of in lieu of building the units on site. But that actually, could be a revision once we do the Nexus study, correct? And come back with in lieu fees?
That is correct. We've also asked our consultant to look at adaptive reuse specifically and convey what other jurisdictions are doing with adaptive reuse and inclusionary housing fees.
And one final question, this is kind of tricky here with the parking situation with AB 2097, and I don't know, I know we have our transportation expert here today. How do we juggle all that together and figure that all out? It looks like we're actually, this is an incentive here, but at the same time, we're moving away from, in the CBD, having parking. And as you're coming up, I just want to know, I work across the street from the phone building, and they don't have a lot of parking, actually. It's actually adjacent to the next street over where they want to build that, a residential building with the storage in the back. So all that space is really taken up by that, and it looks kind of like, is it parking? It's really not all that, the parking that belongs to the phone building. Sorry.
Thank you, Commissioner DeLuccio, through the chair. Juggling parking restrictions, yes, with the AB 2097. The short answer is that where the restrictions are in the AB 2097 for the state requirements are very close to our 2011 general plan direction and subsequent spin-off housing policies related to having no parking in the CBD. So our local regulations were actually ahead of the state regulations for that. Why? It's because the central business district right in our downtown core, that has the lowest vehicle miles traveled in the city. And so if you had to remove parking, that is the best place. Why? Because there's options for walking and biking and transit. That's where, and you can kind of see that too. We do have a graphic, if, Dana, if you could pull that up, where we have the AB 2097 areas with the CBD as for reference. Thank you. So In the green area on the map is the central business district. The qualifying AB 2097 areas are shown in the red, just as a reference. But again, the whole point and to incentivize development, and when you go look through all of our general plan policies, was really to have strategic growth, and the strategic growth was really pointed at our downtown area, because that is where we could handle that development, because we have different alternative transportation choices. And just to also, again, parking equals congestion too. So if you start to have the less parking available, then that helps with our overall goals with the climate action plan to have less congestion, especially in our downtown area.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question. I just feel like this adaptive reuse, we're trying to come up with incentives, and this is almost like a handicap in a sense. It's not a big incentive, perhaps. And I'll just say one thing, in the state density bonus laws, with all that coming down from Sacramento, it's sort of, everything blends together and it sort of takes away from some of the incentives of this whole adaptive use policy, which made it a little difficult to put together, but I thank you very much.
Yeah, I think just to comment on that, for the adaptive reuse, I would say that it's completely in line with the local policies to date with the AUD program, and then the state's direction, again, to, because the cost for parking is so high, and in order to have affordable developments, because parking has been such a barrier, so it's in line with it.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Commissioner Boss.
Thank you. I'm really excited to see this before us today. I think council's been talking about it at least since 2018, so 6 years in the making. I'm glad to see it moving forward. And I understand that we're juggling a lot of other housing element implementation, other legislation. So I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. The inclusionary housing ordinance, I know, is not before us today. So if we wanted to remove inclusionary housing requirements in CBD or reconsider in lieu fees, the time for that would be when the inclusionary housing ordinance is before us.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And then trying to come up with a couple of scenarios, again, focusing on the central business district. If I am a building outside of the central business district, so on Upper State Street, Upper De La Vina, I'm not a hotel, I'm not a historic resource, I want to do less than 50% affordable housing, I would not qualify for adaptive reuse. I'd need to do the normal change in use, state density bonus, correct?
Commissioner Boss, that is correct. The change in use process would still be available for those projects. We're just, if you meet the Goldilocks scenario that we've set up here, you get these incentives by right, and you no longer need to request similar incentives through zoning modifications or through concessions of state density bonus law.
Thank you. So just subjectively, I feel like that excludes a lot of opportunities for adaptive reuse, and I think that's why the commission and council wanted us to move forward with beyond the central business district. And I'm curious, when we're doing the sites inventory for the housing element update, did we identify sites? I know there's a lot of criteria in the sites inventory, but did we specifically seek out sites that could be included using adaptive reuse?
Chair Bauke, Commissioner Boss, there are a bunch of different factors used in identifying those sites in our suitable sites inventory. The bulk of the sites are in priority housing overlay. One of the things we looked at was called the IL ratio, so the improvement value to land value. And that essentially means a site is underdeveloped. So we see sites like on Milpas, you've got a single-story building and a parking lot. So there's potential for redevelopment of these sites. And this should also be a consideration of Planning Commission and Council for adaptive reuse, because these sites that are identified in the suitable sites inventory, if there is adaptive reuse and there's just a couple of units included in that, we have to look at the net change from what we anticipated in the suitable sites inventory to what's provided. And if there's a deficit, we ultimately will have to find those units somewhere else. So while we welcome units citywide, some sites are ripe for redevelopment, and we want to encourage maybe demolition and development of more aggressive housing project. So that's something to keep in mind with this.
Thank you, I appreciate that perspective. Sticking on the central business district, thinking about the initial implementation. So I'm trying to still understand why not go citywide. If it's taken us 6 years to get to initial implementation, I'm nervous about what it'll take for further implementation. So why the staff report talked about availability of transportation methods, quality of life, like parks and rec, access to services. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? I think it was a bit on slide 17, but.
Commissioner Boss, we did look at expanding the geographic area that these Goldilocks projects for adaptive reuse would fall into, but in line with a lot of other city initiatives, as well as Jessica mentioned, the transportation, connectivity and networks, as well as the access to services, jobs, recreation, cultural, social, focusing this housing incentive on the central business district made the most sense from all of the analysis that we conducted. Ultimately, right, it is not our decision that makes up where it is, but staff does recommend that the central business district is the most appropriate place to allow the incentives that we're proposing in this ordinance, and that's why we included it as the applicability category we did.
And so if we were going to move forward with it as the initial implementation, as noted in the staff report, what timeline would you anticipate for further implementation if we were to expand beyond CBD?
I am going to hand that over to Dan.
See, Chair Bauke, Commissioner Boss, we're not anticipating a two-step program with HE1. We've got a lot ahead of us in the housing element and timelines associated with everything. If it's something that the Planning Commission feels strongly about to expand beyond central business district, that can be part of your recommendation to City Council. The HE1 specifically called out focusing on central business district. It's what we've been talking about for years. And as Ms. Grant said, with vehicle miles traveled. So essentially, if you have a good mix of uses that includes jobs and services, there's grocery stores, just things you can get to on foot or bicycle. I think a good way to think of this is the incentives that we're giving, like no open space, no parking. These are things that people need in some places because they're not being provided publicly, like the transit service isn't great, or there aren't parks nearby, like Upper State Street. Upper State Street's a pretty car-dependent area, and we would expect residents up there to want to have cars, and maybe they're parking in neighborhoods adjacent because there isn't parking available. So again, this is the initial proposal and would be the initial ordinance. The city will revisit this at some point. I can't say when at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Bauke and Commissioner Boss, just to add on to that, it doesn't mean that a building in those areas cannot be converted to residential, right? As you noted before, we do have the change of use, and whether it's been at staff hearing officer or planning commission, there have been modifications approved, and that's looked at very permissively because of our desire to incentivize housing. But there are times when those things can be provided. And if that's the case, like, for example, the open space, right? We've seen projects come in where they can provide the open space, and so it's great that they're able to do that rather than getting the modification. So it's nice to be able to look at those on the case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you. Question about the existing building envelope. There was a note in the staff report about allowing minor adjustments. And I think there was a reference to circulation and amenities, and what Mr. Kernall mentioned, like trash. So can you talk a little bit more about other examples of minor adjustments to within the existing building envelope requirement?
So within the existing building envelope, the planning regulations would only relate to the unit size and the requirement to include a residential unit, but planning regulations would not control the circulation or egress within that. That would be a building code requirement that have more impact on the internal redesign of that structure. As part of one of the additional requirements for the planning ordinance, we would restrict that development to the existing envelope with these few allowances for outside the building footprint, and those would be that residential amenity up to 250 square feet. That could be a mail room or a laundry room. And then any egress, circulation, accessibility, or other building code requirements, an elevator, that would just be the whatever minimum to meet those building code requirements. So we would not have a numerical limitation on those ones, just that it has to be justified for building code.
Great, thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, thank you. Next, Vice Chair Wardlow.
Thank you, Chair Bauke, and thank you to staff and for the staff report. I felt like this was really comprehensive. I do feel like Commissioner Boss asked a lot of my questions, but I will just maybe ask a little bit differently. So going to the CBD only area, I agree with the public comments that have been made and the direction that we provided at the joint hearing with council that this should definitely be expanded outside of the CBD. It sounds like staff is open to taking that direction and expanding outside of it if there was consensus on that. My question is, when we're looking at the coastal zone, given that the majority of the hotels that we have in the city are in the coastal zone, and given that we're having a lot more come online, if there was a scenario where, the Best Western went bankrupt and they wanted to convert that to housing, as we currently have this ordinance written now, since we haven't done the work to address it in the coastal zone, they wouldn't be allowed to do that. Is that correct?
Chair Bauke and Commissioner Wardlow, that is correct. However, just to acknowledge that many of the hotels in the coastal zone are in zones that only allow hotels. So residential use not being a priority in the coastal zone wouldn't even be an allowed use in that zone. And so where the adaptive, if we were to pursue it in the coastal zone, where it would actually be applicable would be a much smaller than kind of what you envision as the entire coastal zone. It would be only areas that allow residential as well.
Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate that. So just so I understand more, so like giving a different example, so like the light manufacturing area, which is not allowed for housing as of now. If we were to include that area, I'm not saying that we're going to, but if we were to recommend that, then you would be allowed to convert those to housing as well. So why doesn't that apply for the hotels in the coastal zone? And I apologize if this is a silly question. I'm just
No,
not
that's okay,
really
Commissioner
understanding.
Wardlow. May not be fully understanding your question, but a lot of the coastal zone where we have our hotels are in either the HRC1 zone or HRC2 zone. And so those do not allow residential uses. If you're speaking of areas such as the funk zone where we allow different types of use, yes, that is an area where you could see a hotel or a residential use. But that's also a zone that was, there was a lot of discussion and back and forth with the Coastal Commission as to what size hotel is appropriate, how many residential units are appropriate. And so they may not be as open to this type of an ordinance in that zone. I think it would take quite a bit of discussion with them to get to a point where they are comfortable with it. So it's not just what the city wants in the coastal zone. We have to also understand the Coastal Commission's priorities and what they might be willing to allow.
Okay. So taking the light manufacturing zone as an example, part of that is in the coastal zone, I think. Part of it is not, right? It's like the area behind Milpas, between Milpas and like Garden. If we could move forward with including that as part of this zone, as part of an ability to do adaptive reuse, technically, correct? Or we can't?
Chair Bauke, Commissioner Wardlow, we have some competing policies. So we have policies that encourage preservation of these manufacturing and industrial uses. They're not good neighbors to residential typically. So if residential is allowed, then there's complaints about these other uses. But I believe one of the city council members refer to them as sacred uses. These folks that maintain our buildings and streets in the city. So it's possible to do that, but there are other considerations.
Okay. So when we look at like the west side though, as an example, right? So San Andreas area, we could apply this adaptive reuse to that area, correct? If we expand outside the CBD without this kind of conflicting policy perspective? Okay.
It's possible.
And then I just want to, because there's been a lot of discussion around the inclusionary piece. So as this is written now, the current inclusionary requirements that we have in the city would apply in this scenario, right? And I know we're going to have a whole evaluation of the inclusionary, and all of that is coming after we get our study back. Correct?
Vice Chair Wardlow, yes, that is correct.
Okay, great. On the stormwater piece, can staff, I appreciate the explanation that was given earlier. Is there, if we're saying that Creeks doesn't believe that the majority of these projects would trigger this, but then we're hearing from, public comment developers, the community, that it in fact would, is there an opportunity for us to create kind of flexibility language around that requirement, just as we have in other components of this? Noting that it has been, we're hearing it's an issue.
Chair Bauke, Commissioner Wardlow, this is beyond our zoning ordinance. So this is implementation of the Clean Water Act. So there's a NPDES permit through the Regional Water Quality Control Board that the city gets. So it's a whole different set of decision makers to allow for more flexibility in that. But this is a conversation that's happening.
Okay. Okay, maybe somebody else can kind of elaborate on that. Okay, that's the remainder of my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Wiscombe, followed by Commissioner Barnwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for all the work you've done and the excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the public commenters. I think your comments are really important. I'm going to ask another question about inclusionary. This has been on the agenda with developers for a long time as a stumbling block, a hurdle to actually doing anything downtown. And I want to know if there's a possibility, I know we're doing this feasibility study, but it's taking a long time, and there are lots of jurisdictions that have in lieu fees instead of building the units. And why can we not do a temporary ordinance that allows us to do in lieu fees at some reasonable rate for this particular ordinance, and get out of having to build the units, which is a big stumbling block? And have you looked at that? That's my question.
Chair Bauke, Commissioner Wiscombe, we're almost there. So we almost have a draft for public review. These analyses are required by the state at times to determine inclusionary housing fees, and we're fulfilling our obligation to the state in our housing element to do this study. These things all take time, but we're almost there with this. And the comment that we've heard from the developers about wanting an in lieu fee instead of building units, they're analyzing that as an option, and this will be part of the conversation with Planning Commission and City Council moving forward. And BAE, our consultant, interviewed several developers and got a lot of feedback on our current program and what they would like to see in a new program and their costs and the local realities of developing.
So when do we anticipate having this done? Because it's been on the table for a long time.
So, yes, so this is one of the 32 housing element programs. The housing element says it's to be done by the end of next year. We're well ahead of schedule with it. So we're, again, anticipating an administrative draft by February at the latest for staff review, and after that, it will come to the Planning Commission and be out for public review. So this is something that's pretty soon.
Okay.
Chair Balke and Commissioner Wiscombe, just also to keep in mind, if we were to do a special ordinance just for this, to get rid of what you call the stumbling block, it would probably push this out farther, because I guarantee you we would get comments from the public and pushback if we don't have a study that says how we're setting those fees. So I think this way, if it's set to go with our inclusionary, when we change the inclusionary provisions in the ordinance, this would automatically just tie into that.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay. And to go to SWIMP, I just want to talk about that for a minute. I understand, Mr. Gullett, what you said, there's lots of other implications. Are we having ongoing talks with Creeks Division about this adaptive reuse ordinance downtown and SWIMP requirements? Because apparently these folks here have a very different read on the situation than the Creeks Department does, who says, well, most of these projects won't be impacted by SWIMP anyway. So I just like to, I'm hearing two different things here. So I just want to know if we're actively pursuing conversations and dialogue with Creeks staff to maybe get rid of another or alleviate the regulations for, the downtown area or State Street.
Yeah, I can't speak to everything that's being considered by Creek staff with changes to the stormwater management program. They have offered to come to the next hearing about adaptive reuse before the Planning Commission, if the Planning Commission would like them to. And we'll certainly convey all the comments that we've heard today and encourage more dialogue.
Okay, that's great. I would love to have them here at our next hearing on this. Okay, and then when we get to the additional area, these are just some niggly things, but you say up to 250 square feet. Have you considered a percentage? Because building envelopes are very different. So could we add a percentage and 250 square feet, or, is that possible?
Commissioner Wiscombe, yes, it's definitely possible. I will say staff did discuss using a percentage as the allowed amount that a building could do versus the numerical 250 square feet, right? That 250 square feet is only a limit if you're doing a residential amenity. If you need to add an elevator or a staircase for egress, that's not within that 250 square feet requirement, because that is something for fire, life safety, which the building code is very serious about. As part of our internal kind of decision to do 250 square feet, a quantitative number versus a percentage, we did start to consider some past example change and use projects. Sometimes they're very small, and so 10%, right, if we're just throwing out a number, might not be enough to actually do anything with if this project is a small project. Whereas, say, the reuse of the Nordstrom's building, 10% of that floor area would be enormous. And so we elected to propose a numerical 250 square feet rather than a percentage of the building, because it kind of evens the playing field on what a project could propose versus having less certainty with a percentage.
Okay, but 250 square feet at the Nordstrom building would be nothing. And that's kind of my point, is that I think maybe we need some sort of Mr. Busk has something to say.
Commissioner Wiscombe, just more food for thought. You're correct, that's nothing for a building the size of Nordstrom's. On the other hand, they have a lot more internal floor area to play with where might make more sense where they could create their residential lobby within the footprint of that existing building and might not need that extra space quite as much, just because of the flexibility of having that large building. So there were definitely a lot of considerations that went into us coming up with that 250 square foot size.
Okay, and then the other one is the 35-foot depth for that. Now, is that, how did we come up with that number? Is that,
Previously, the draft ordinance had required that 50% of the ground floor be for commercial. When we took in the input from the community that this might be a little bit extreme and make projects not feasible, we started to look back at what the intent of requiring that ground floor commercial was, and it really was to activate the pedestrian level facade so you have a vibrant streetscape. That's why this area was changed to just be the same area of State Street that the State Street Master Plan is focused on, right? That's a streetscape plan, so having a very active pedestrian level facade coincides with a lot of those goals. And the depth of 35 feet was correlated to the kind of rule of thumb for commercial spaces that are viable and usable. We looked at studies that had been done as part of the objective design and development standards, where we had a consultant giving us a lot of their great input, and that ordinance requires that minimum habitable space depth for projects. So we were using some of the same numbers and the research that had been done on another staff effort to inform this one.
okay, thank you for that. Okay, and if we expanded this, as some of my fellow commissioners are talking about, expanded this ordinance to all of Title 30 zone, let's say, just everywhere in Title 30, I don't know really how to ask this. I understand Ms. Grant's, we might be impactful in a neighborhood with parking or something like that, but is there any reason why we can't, we have the CBD, we have one space maximum, one parking space per unit maximum. Is there any reason why we can't take the parking regs that apply outside of the CBD and actually expand this ordinance to outside the CBD? Are you following me?
So Commissioner Wiscombe, I think essentially what you're asking is, could we allow adaptive reuse, but maybe reduce or change some of the incentives that apply to development, for example, in Upper State?
Yeah, maybe remove the incentive of the parking, yeah, and so that if the building, the commercial building became commercial and residential, and, and it would be impactful to the neighborhood to have, there's only a couple parking spaces. Can we just revise the ordinance for outside there that would allow the parking requirements to apply? Is that?
Chair Bauke and Commissioner Wiscombe, that's certainly possible. I think that's where we would need to do additional research. I think, as Mr. Gullett also mentioned, Upper State is one of our areas of kind of lacking access to open space and public parks.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question comes up, well, do we also want to waive open space for those units? So it just brings up a lot more questions that need more analysis. So yes, it's something we could do, and we appreciate your feedback on that, but that's why staff was starting with this geographic area.
Okay. Okay, I think that covers most of my, most of my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Barnwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm gonna come at this as, it's not too difficult to do, a complete rookie on some of these terms and what we're talking about. I'd like to start with the idea that we have used the phrase, well, we're not in charge of that, to apply, for example, to the groundwater issues and to a whole bunch of other things that are different committees in different sections of the community. I think if you went out on the sidewalk and asked people, who's in charge of planning the city, it's us. And they are under us in terms of how do we do the city. Now, I realize that technically within the bureaucratic org chart, they aren't under us. But we have to use our muscle, whatever it is, to get the creeks and the water and all those departments to get on board with this, what we're doing here. My question is, how do we do that? And with some urgency. Now, let me also add, I want everything I'm going to say has got a neon sign above it, which is housing crisis. The city council put together an ad hoc committee, the name of which was housing crisis. I don't get a feeling of crisis in anything that we're talking about here. I feel like we're just moving along, and it's kind of the way we're going to do it. Now, I know we're under constraints. I recognize that. But I just don't think, it doesn't feel that way. Now, that doesn't mean that what you've done here isn't outstanding. I think it's incredible. But we don't seem to be acting like it's important or that it's a crisis. For example, the discussion of expanding this into other areas of the community, we are using as an argument the San Roque area. But the San Roque area unique circumstances should not drive the discussion of Milpas and Haley. It seems to me as though Milpas and Haley can be included in this original one that we're doing now and leave the more problematic and difficult things like the San Roque area out of this discussion. But there's a phrase in here, I want to read this. I apologize, but I think it's important. It says, this is in favor of only doing the CBD. Limiting the adaptive reuse ordinance to this area and not allowing the incentives across the city will focus potential creation of housing units in the CBD as a means to revitalize the area. Now, I'm going to change a couple of pronouns and nouns, and I'm going to read it like this. Limiting the adaptive reuse ordinance to this area and not allowing the proposed incentives across the city will fail to focus on potential creation of housing units throughout the city as a means to revitalize the entire city. We just made a decision, we just made a choice, and I'm not sure it's the right one. And it's those kinds of phrases that have caused our thinking to go in a certain direction. And the council and the planning commission were in favor of expanding this. Okay, I just want to come down heavy on that. We're missing an opportunity, and it's important. And it's when I look it up in other communities, they're doing it. We're behind. Other communities that are similar to us seem to have put these things into black letter code, and we have not. I presume that the adaptive reuse is directly related to making it easier to build things, generally. On page 6, we refer to new residential units. The change in use process for, as you mentioned, non-residential to non-residential, residential remains available without the incentives of the adaptive reuse ordinance. I got to thinking about 8 and 10 unit 1950s apartment buildings on De La Vina Street. What if someone wanted to remain within those buildings, but instead of having 8 units, they wanted 12 or 16 units? Because we can use smaller units now than those. That would not enjoy the benefit of the adaptive reuse changes. Is that correct? And why shouldn't it be able to?
Chair Bauke and Commissioner Barnwell, it's correct. This ordinance was not written for residential to residential conversions. One thing I will note, most of those older developments currently exceed our density limits, so they actually already have more than what would be allowed by the code. So in most cases, the density just would prohibit it. But I understand where you're coming from, is it's an existing building shell, kind of using that same thought process of just putting in as many units into an existing shell as we can. The state ADU law has actually facilitated some of that in terms of converting existing residential parking into additional units, or parts of apartments that are not residential units can be converted, accessory spaces, that kind of thing. So we are seeing some of that in that way. So those are just some of the considerations.
Well, I mean, if something like that did come up, it would be unfortunate that we had to actually specify that residential to residential was excluded, when I can think of examples of where we might not want to exclude it. But moving on, the parking issue, good discussion about the parking. Now I'm on page 8. We say, this requirement aligns with AB 2263. The criteria is intended to retain parking supply for residents while minimizing the impacts on existing street parking. We don't know what the street parking is. We have no idea the number of parking stalls at the curbs anywhere in the community. And yet we're using it as a basis for suggesting that we're going to do something because of the impacts to existing street parking. And there's no nexus there. We don't know what that is. And also, I want to go to the idea that in the CBD, we're going to build with no parking. And if those units are, in some form affordable, those people have cars. And so we fall back on the idea that they get to use the downtown parking structures. But we don't have an apparatus set up for that to work. We haven't done the study of, if the structures were built for commercial and we want to layer on top of that the potential residential uses that would come from allowing buildings that don't have any parking, what is it going to be like? What is the future going to be like? We haven't done that study. So I think there's some holes in our ability to grapple with the idea that it isn't housing, it's housing transportation. Okay, every time we talk about housing, we have to talk about transportation, and transportation component is parking. And it's a huge driver in all of these things that we're discussing right here, and it's almost a tooth fairy concept on what's actually going to happen, because everyone has a car. Everyone has a car. So if we build without parking, we as a city, as a community who sees the big picture from up high, we have to make adjustments citywide in some form to create space for those cars to park somewhere if they're not going to have to park on the residential site. We haven't done that. And I think we need to do it. I think it's, particularly in view of everything that we're saying in this document right here, it seems essential that we do that. Everything that everyone else has said here, I agree with 100%. I want to wrap by saying, I read this like 3 times, and I don't know who put this together, but it's a great document. It is really, really an effort to follow the needs and the rules and everything, and I applaud it. But I just don't think we've gone far enough. Particularly, I want to go back to the inclusionary issue and the adaptive reuse being applied to different geographic areas. I don't think this conversation should be driven by what the needs are at San Roque, particularly when we want to talk about Haley and Milpas. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I've got a number of questions, so let's start with, in your staff report on page 3, you note 3 assembly bills, 1 dealing with historic resources. I understand that. Could you explain, since this is new legislation, what AB 1490 does in regard to adaptive reuse and AB 529 as to adaptive reuse as far as a quick, we'll call it layperson summary, if there's such a thing with legislation?
Chair Balke, pardon my summary. It's been a while since I've read these in full, so I'm going to give you what a recap is and how we are accommodating it in the ordinance that we're proposing. So Assembly Bill 1490, Affordable Housing Development Projects Adaptive Reuse. The state is allowing, they're called extremely affordable adaptive reuse projects. There are requirements that correlate to low and very low income. It's 100% of that project must be low or very low, excluding the manager's unit. They have to be within a certain distance of a major transit stop. So for the city, that is the Amtrak station and the transit center, MTD. And then it has to be infill and it can't be next to industrial. There's a couple other caveats that a project must meet in order to be considered an extremely affordable adaptive reuse project. If you do meet all of them, the benefits that you get align with the incentives that we are proposing, the unlimited density, as well as the no parking requirement and no open space. I believe those are the three that they allow. So we are in alignment with what that state law is, but we are exceeding it because we are allowing more projects to be on the 50% affordable units at the different affordability levels than would be allowed under that state legislation. And then Assembly Bill 529, this was also passed in 2023, like Assembly Bill 1490. It has to do with a study of building code requirements as they relate to adaptive reuse projects. It is a reporting requirement. They just kicked off this effort in August of this year, 2024, and I believe just last week closed what they were calling the RFI period, where they were asking people to submit comments to the state about different requirements in the building code that may be prohibitive to adaptive reuse projects. They are taking all of this information and will be producing a report, I believe, by the end of this year or next, December of 2026, we're going to say conservatively, that they'll produce a report on what building code requirements may be considered a hindrance to adaptive reuse. Again, that's at the state level. They are the ones who publish the building code that we adopt. So those are the two assembly bills that do relate either with the incentives that we're proposing or may impact down the line things that we adopt locally for building code.
Okay, thank you. And you touched on my next question, which was, early in my career I was a building official, and I remember doing a couple adaptive reuse projects during that time period. And the issues that we ran into were primarily building code issues, and I don't expect the building code has gotten any easier to use in the 40 years since. So, question is there an evaluation internally going on with the projects that you have done and ones that might be in the process as to any amendments that the city can think of doing to the building code, which is not a zoning thing, it's not our little purview, that would actually help the implementation of adaptive reuse?
Chair Bauke, there is a process within the building permit review. I believe it's called the code alteration and modification process. It is a way that a project can come in. It's flexibility in the building code standards, right? Fire, life, safety is paramount, so you can't do anything to undermine that. But it does allow a project to more or less prove an alternative means of compliance, as well as two other building codes that are available for adaptive reuse projects, one of which is the historical building code, as well as the existing building code. And those are in place. They're available to the city. We have, I believe it's a resolution back in 2022, where a project can use those alternative building code requirements. Again, fire, life, safety is still going to be paramount, and you can't waive anything that might, life and limb, but there are alternative means to meet building code requirements without explicitly meeting them as they're stated. That flexibility is built in our process. I don't believe that the Building and Safety is working on any amendments, but that's not something I could speak to, unfortunately.
Yeah, that was sort of my next follow-up question because, when I was a building official, we actually went through a whole process of amending the state-adopted code with, we're talking our code at the end of the day ended up being about an additional third to the code that the state, or may it be the international or the state building code. And I was just wondering if there's an internal process in the building department, because I think this is, we can do all the stuff at this level, but that technical stuff, including SWIP, which we'll get into in a second, really becomes the constraint, other than economic issues. We'll leave that there. There's that whole economics, but those technical issues could be really problematic. So I just wanted to touch on that, and to the extent direction from this body is to, let's do things to work with that would be helpful, so we don't just adopt something here that can't technically happen or is very, very problematic on the other end. So got a couple other clarification questions that my fellow colleagues have definitely touched on most of mine. One of the things that has come up in adaptive reuse, and I'm not sure within the existing building envelope allows for uses of roofs. I mean, the city of Los Angeles, the roof use became something that was allowed as an additive thing with adaptive reuse and not counted towards square footage. And I was wondering, are we allowing any kind of roof improvements to be falling in with the within the existing building envelope definition?
Chair Bauke, the things that you're referencing, I believe, would be like outdoor area, possibly trellises to cover it, but not necessarily enclosed area? Or
Yeah, basically, we'd be able to use the roof, because right now, a lot of
Correct.
times, the roof's just there and not being used. And if you start using, you're starting using buildings for residential purposes, one of the things in a lot of urban areas, people go, hey, well, let's go up on the roof and, and enjoy and recreate there. And I know that was a constraint in one of the changes the city of Los Angeles made, and they were one of the first ones that really got into adaptive reuse in 1999. So I wasn't sure if our definition included allowances for the roof, not counting towards square footages and this.
Chair Bauke, that is correct. We would not count that as square footage unless it's fully enclosed. And so we have very clear definitions as to what that means. For example, if the elevator were to extend onto the roof, that's acceptable. That's not considered additional floor area necessarily. So yes, we would encourage the use of roofs as long as there's not new enclosed floor area.
Okay. Another question is and I think I got it in the staff report, I just want to confirm. If somebody has a space and they want to add a mezzanine, and basically an intermediate level, that square footage doesn't, that's within the envelope and that's fine to be used. That's
Correct.
another thing
Yes, Chair Bauke, so we removed some of the limiting language that was in the conceptual draft ordinance that we began with that did regulate the interior of the building a little bit more. So we are now proposing, if you want to add a mezzanine, if you have the floor-to-floor heights to do so, then yes, please do it.
They're free to do that. Okay. Next question, and I wasn't sure because you referenced another code section, and I didn't have a chance to go back and backtrack. What is our minimum residential unit size allowed under the adaptive reuse ordinance? And how does that compare to the building code's minimum?
Yeah, Chair Bauke, it's slide 37, I found it. So that code section is 30.140.150, and I amended this slide to include for a studio that's a minimum unit size of 220 square feet, and if you have a bedroom or more, the minimum unit size is 400 square feet. This is in alignment with the building code requirements.
Okay, so the 220 and the 400 are the building code.
Yes.
It's moved over the years, and I wasn't sure what it is today. So, okay. And why the average? I mean, I can see the cap. I'm just trying to understand the goal of a developer would be trying to sort of, from a market standpoint, maximize their situation, and they would tend towards smaller units in the first place. So, are you thinking somebody's going to want to go to 12? I mean, it seems counter to the market and counter trying to, is this a sort of upper barrier so we don't get extra units or something? I'm just trying to understand the thought process.
Chair Bauke, there are many people out there who are not developers who would love to live on an entire floor of a building in Santa Barbara's downtown. And in fact, the Granada theater building had upper floors converted to residential units many years ago, so it's,
So this is sort of an anti-penthouse.
Yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you for that. Let's see. Okay, that's all the questions I have. A whole bunch of comments, but we'll do that later. Lucille, do you have any more questions?
I do. I have a question. So I've been staring at our zoning map, and I'm hearing comments about expanding up beyond the central business district and looking at all of Title 30. So I want to make sure if we are giving recommendation to expand to all of Title 30, does that include some manufacturing zones? So manufacturing commercial and some of light manufacturing, but it would exclude the manufacturing that is in the coastal zone or Title 28. So looking at a map with light manufacturing on the inland side of the 101, that would be included in Title 30, but the ocean side of the 101, that is Title 28, so that would not be included. Does that does that make sense?
So, maybe. So we have a pyramid zoning, and it allows residential uses in all but 2 non-residential zones. So non-residential zones are the commercial and office zones, so CG, OR, CM, there's 4 of them, I'm forgetting the last one. And then the manufacturing and industrial, there's the MC and then the MI. Residential is not allowed in MI, and that is the area between Milpas and Garden, below about Haley to the 101 on the inland side. So while that is a Title 30 zone, residential use is not allowed in that zone at all. So this adaptive reuse ordinance would allow a non-residential building to convert to residential, but residential has to be an allowed use in the zone that that project is located within. So if a project wants to create residential in MI, it couldn't even under anything in our zoning ordinance.
So if we wanted to make the recommendation that applied to all of Title 30, including MC and MI today, we could not?
Yeah, Chair Balke, Commissioner Boss, the allowance of housing in MI is arguably not consistent with the general plan, so we would recommend against that. The MC, we had a conversation about that with the hotel zones, and the Planning Commission and the City Council was very strong in not allowing hotels in that area and encouraging housing in that area. So I think CM, it would be appropriate. Title 30 applies to all inland. Would recommend against allowing adaptive reuse in the single unit zones. There's some buildings in those zones that could be problematic to the use of those properties that would be inconsistent with the zoning ordinance and the general plan as well.
Okay, so we could make a recommendation that adaptive reuse be applicable in all of Title 30 where residential use is allowed.
Chair Balke, Commissioner Boss, I'd say with the exception of single unit residential.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Without any more questions, let's get into commentary, and Commissioner DeLuccio will.
Yeah, just to clarify something here, Title 30. Right now, we do have an adaptive reuse ordinance, correct? Is there there's nothing, so nobody can do adaptive reuse right now?
Commissioner
With a change of
DeLuccio,
use, they can.
they can do change of use, but we do not have an adaptive reuse ordinance that just allows it by right, but our pyramid zoning does give that opportunity through change of use.
With a change of use, but there's nothing called, written up. This would be the first time I'm writing something up in the ordinance, but how come it can't, that's just so special about this city, how we do stuff. We're starting with the CBD, and then possibly we'll expand out later, instead of as long as you're doing this, I don't understand, it's not, how is it so different that all you're doing is adding some incentives as part of this write-up, and I don't understand why we're working backwards, starting with the CBD and not just not adapting it citywide, because time is of the essence. Where at this point we have so much to do, and I feel we're so behind, and we're just losing time and steam. And you would think that you would just adopt this. So I just want to say that. Thank you.
I know it wasn't a real question, but we do that occasionally. So, okay. Next, Commissioner Wardlow.
Okay, I apologize for continuing down this path. I just want to make sure I understand. So you mentioned, so the industrial zoning aspect, right? It does not, all of the industrial zoning does not allow housing, is that right? Or is there one subsection that does allow housing?
Yeah, Vice Chair Wardlow, there are two Title 30 zones in the manufacturing zones. One of them is manufacturing commercial, that's the MC zone, and the other one is the manufacturing industrial, that's the MI zone. Multi-unit residential is allowed in MC.
MC, okay.
It is not allowed in MI.
Got it, okay. That's very helpful. That was the clarification I was trying to understand. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody want comments? Comments? No. Okay, Commissioner Boss, Wiscombe, then DeLuccio, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, so I just really want to appreciate the background and the years of work and changes that have gone into this through housing element and through feedback from several different city councils now, several different planning commissions. So just thank you. I understand that it's really complex. And I'm really glad to see that it not only complies with state laws, but goes beyond state incentives too. So I think that's something that we're hearing from developers, and that will encourage housing. A comment about the suitable sites inventory, thinking about our next housing element update. I think it would be helpful to include potential adaptive reuse opportunities in suitable sites inventory, so 4 years from now. And then I think we've had this discussion about expanding, wanting the adaptive reuse ordinance to apply to all of Title 30 where residential is allowed, including MC, for example, excluding single family, if I'm getting that right. And then there were also some questions about the required ground floor non-residential space on State Street, and I'm wondering if it would be helpful to have a percentage rather than the specific 35-foot depth. I think those are my comments.
All right, Commissioner Wiscombe, followed by Commissioner DeLuccio, and Vice Chair Wardlow after that, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Commissioner Boss's comments to expand Title 30 to all residential zones, excluding the single-family zones. I also agree with her comment about using a percentage rather than a 35-foot depth. And in addition to that, some sort of more flexibility on the additional 250 square feet. Maybe some sort of percentage for and/or scenario, but I think that's just too, I'm trying to get away from limiting them and then have someone come in with 300 square feet and they don't qualify because it just doesn't work. So if the 300 square feet is reasonable. Let's see. I think it's imperative that staff continues to work with creeks. I understand they're a different department, but on SWIMP regulations, maybe there's a possibility of identifying buildings downtown that are adjacent to one another that could share stormwater facilities if they need to be changed, upgraded. I don't know. There's got to be some just creative ways to really work on this to incentivize adaptive reuse. I think Commissioner DeLuccio mentioned several iterations ago about HLC involvement, and I think that's important. They might play a role here. And I'm going to get on my bandwagon about in lieu fees. It needs to be done. I was pleased to hear Mr. Gullett say it's way ahead of where it's supposed to be at this point in time, which is great. We need to get that done. That, I think it's been a stumbling block. I mean, I've been on this commission for 8 years. It has been the stumbling block downtown. Is one of the stumbling blocks is the we can't use in lieu fees. We have to build the housing. If we can do in lieu fees and deposit the money into an affordable housing trust fund, which we have now, then let the experts that build the affordable housing do it, and let the developers who can build the residential housing without the inclusionary portion do their part. And I think that will go a long way. And let's see, do I have anything else to say? Probably not. No, I think that I appreciate the incentives that you developed. I think they're well thought out, and I think you've done a really thorough job. Whenever any of us up here have asked you a question, you've had a really good answer for it and how much research you've done on it. So I think you've just done a really great job on this. And I just want to see it go through, and I want to see it start to work for us. And I think there's maybe a couple more steps that need to take place before it's really going to work, but it's on its way. So thank you very much.
All right, next, Commissioner DeLuccio, followed by Vice Chair Wardlow.
Before I forget, I want to, I'm glad that Commissioner Wiscombe is going to be coming back next year on the commission. And it is HLC, that comment about, yes, if we can get some comments from them and interact a little bit. HRC is Historical Resources Commission, where I used to be, something else. They had an actual commission on historic resources. Again, of course, we'd love to see it expand in all of Title 30 where it would be permitted. But at the same time, it'd be good to even see this get adapted. So, and then also, we still have a couple of other comments. As far as the first floor, I know the 801 State Street, I toured that building where it has been, there's residential in the front, there's residential in the back, and there's commercial in the front. And I know that's the concept, a percentage or square footage would a minimum requirement for the retail in the front. So I like the approach. Maybe it's not a square footage, maybe it's a percentage. But I think that's a really good approach. And thank you for reducing it from 100% very low to 50%. That can be mod low or very low as one of the categories to qualify. That'll help us with the missing middle and to address workforce housing by putting that in there. Open space, maintain, I know the Commissioner Boss is always talking about open space here, being sure we have enough open space. So I'm so glad that buildings would have to stay within the footprint for adaptive reuse. And if there is open space already, that would have to be preserved. And especially like any kind of streamlining process that we can do. I know that this won't have to go a pre-app or the concept review, and also the fee, and the process be streamlined and probably be reduction in fees to do that. And that's always welcoming in the community and by developers. And I guess we've addressed stormwater runoff, and maybe we can have somebody here next time to talk about that a little more. And also pay in lieu fee into the housing fund in lieu of putting the units on site. That's, as you can see, we're all passionate about that, and we really want to see that move forward, and it looks like it is being moved forward. So I want to thank you. I hope I haven't beat up on you guys. I think you guys do a wonderful job. I think staff does a great job, and I know we really appreciate it. So thank you.
Okay, Vice Chair Wardlow, followed by Commissioner Barnwell.
Thank you, Chair. First, yes, thank you to staff. This has been, a long time coming, and I think there's been substantial progress made. I really like a lot of the adjustments that have been made. as that are proposed. So I think we're in a really good place. I think the biggest thing, as you're hearing consensus across the board, is that we really want to see the adaptive reuse ordinance applied to every area of the city under Title 30 that allows residential except for single-family residential. I think that's really crucial to getting this done. As you all have explained, it's very unlikely that we will come back and amend this again later, so let's get it right the first time. I think it would be a huge missed opportunity to not get this right now and make sure that we have the most eligible sites available to be able to utilize this program that you've all worked so hard to develop. So I really hope that that is very clearly coming back as part of this. I agree with the flexibility on kind of the building envelope piece that some of the commissioners have mentioned. I think moving to a percentage point may make more sense, but I do want to make sure that that flexibility is there. I liked to see it, but I think that for a developer, it may need to be a little bit more clear. I again want to note that it seems that it is very important that we get that same type of flexibility language that we are including for other components of eligibility to be included around the stormwater requirements. You know, I defer to staff on what that's going to take to work with Creeks, but I really hope that the next time that either we have a representative from Creeks, as my fellow commissioner mentioned, or that, you know, that this is addressed and that there's some type of language around this, because, you know, if Creeks is saying that it's not going to be an issue, but we are hearing that it is going to be an issue, again, let's proactively address that so we don't have to try to amend this later, which we probably won't do. And then lastly, on the inclusionary piece, you know, I've heard a lot of discussion about this. You know, I am a strong believer that the inclusionary requirement should be included and maintained to be required in the central business district. I am very excited to see the study come back. I know we are all anxiously awaiting this. As you know, my hope is that we are increasing the inclusionary and we are increasing the in lieu fees. Just as an example, the city of Santa Monica requires 30% inclusionary, and that is applied across the city and applied across the board in their adaptive reuse policy. So we are at 10%. I think that, you know, requiring that is, you know, as we already stand, is not unreasonable, and I look forward to the study coming back to hopefully increase that. But as I said in the beginning, really excited with a lot of the updates that have been made here. I think we're really close, and thank you so much to staff.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair. Next, Commissioner Barnwell. Your turn, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was sitting here thinking we're all emphatic about the things we want to do, and you guys are just sitting there being so diplomatic, and I want to compliment you on that. And thank God you're not coming back at us the way we're coming at you. I appreciate that. But you can tell that we're passionate about this, and we do believe it's a crisis, and I know you guys are under different marching orders than we are, so we'll have to do our job, and you guys do yours, because I think you're doing it very, very well. On the topics that my fellow commissioners just discussed, the percentage versus the 35-foot depth, I'm not sure how you'd figure out that percentage. I am in favor of the 35-foot depth from my own experience in the wide world. I want to emphasize again, I don't know how we do it. Maybe it has to come from the council, but we have to work with Creeks and get that stormwater thing ironed out. We just have to. And if it isn't us, then we have to diplomatically arrange how we can work with them to make it happen. The incentives are great that you put in here. I like the way you've been able to answer all these questions. We haven't been able to ask you something that you were flummoxed by, so you must have thought this through. You may indeed be going back to your office and being just as emphatic as we are and throwing things around, but you're not doing it here. That's good. The open space on the roof I really liked. I don't know how we incentivize that, but that's a really good idea. The in lieu fees are just so important. They're just so important. And then also, is it possible for the staff who has stuck with the CBD as the only area that we're discussing here, is it possible that we can extend in this document, extend to maybe not the entire Title 30, but areas like the West Side or Haley or Milpas, not worry about San Roque and not worry about those other areas? Because I think the areas that I just mentioned are very similar to the CBD, and So anything we can do to expand it in that regard, I would be in favor of. And then I also want to say we need a better discussion of parking. We don't have that. But thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, staff, very much.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. Okay, I'll start off with my comments. And there's a long list here, so let's just run through them, and a lot of it is consensus of what my fellow commissioners. It's clear to me that we need to apply this citywide to the extent feasible, and that includes the coastal zone, but, you know, I understand the long list that's piling up on the amendments to Title 28, but you can add this to it. But I believe we should do this all now as far as Title 30 and expand it beyond the CUV. I understand the rationale. I mean, your rationale made a lot of sense, but I think my fellow commissioners and myself have the feeling that, and we've seen this, there's this time delay, and we'd rather just be a little ahead of things instead of chugging along in pieces. So to the extent we can get this to be citywide, that would be great. I do think there's a need for some consideration for some kind of allowance and of additions. You know, 5, 10%, something, because usually you're going to find is something in the rear of the building's not going to work, and then you're going to need to do something, and it may be a combination of a stairway or an elevator, but then you've got sort of this weird thing, the elevator only takes this piece, and you just have this thing jutting out, and you might want to add some more square footage so it actually architecturally looks correct at the end of the day. So there should be some give and take and some allowance for that. We talked about the inclusionary requirement. I agree with my fellow commissioners. As to adaptive reuse projects, the inclusionary requirement at whatever percentage it is, and we can have that conversation later, should probably be addressed as an in lieu fee. These are small projects. It's one or two units usually. It's not going to be, and just the operational stuff to the owner operator is very, very problematic to do in that context. So it's ripe for an in lieu fee. But the in lieu fee should be an appropriate dollar figure unless we do something else. And I'm going to put this out. I've put this out before. If we had an enhanced infrastructure finance district in our CBD, I'd be willing to let go of in lieu inclusionary fees, just take that X increment and apply it to the housing fund. But there's, yes, you know, if we had an enhanced infrastructure finance district, and these projects will increase their assessed valuation when they're done, capturing that additional tax increment that comes from the property taxes for the higher assessed valuation should just be plowed directly into the housing fund, and we wouldn't be making this like a per developer problem. But and the downtown's the hardest part to do anyway, but we would actually get the money directly into the housing fund, and from the housing fund to folks that actually build affordable housing, instead of expecting the private sector folks. Some can do affordable housing, and some of them, that's just not their thing. And so we're always going to be fighting that tension. We're better off having you know, those who do affordable housing do affordable housing instead of trying to incrementalize it. So it's sort of a big system thing. But, you know, I understand from the city manager that they are, as part of the BAE study, going to be looking at an enhanced infrastructure finance district. So that's something that we will be seeing next year, but I want to mention that to my fellow commissioners. This is sort of the global way of solving these problems. Another global way, a problem we have here is the whole C3 SWIP water quality things, which honestly in a downtown need to be done on a system-wide basis, and then people pay their proportionate share. And you know, treat the downtown like it's some kind of master plan development, because really it is a master plan development, and do a citywide, public works-based water quality system for the entire downtown that people pay into. And that's another thing that can be financed through an infrastructure finance district. So just, especially considering we have these big projects like Paseo Nuevo coming through, which the change in tax increment from that project from what it is worth today, and if it gets approved as it's being contemplated, are just going to be radically different assessed valuations that can be recaptured and used back to the public benefit for the whole downtown. So moving on to some more little pieces. The square footage, I'm glad you got, I would say, allow the flexibility, allow the minimum. The sites will dictate sort of what they can do, and if I have extra square footage when I do a bunch of small units, or I want to do, then I'll go to a bigger size, but we don't want to promote larger than needed units. So to the extent you can do whatever to, usher along smaller units, the better. Whether we could go to micro units, there's a whole conversation on that in some other more urban areas, but I don't think we need to do that today. My comments again, I'll just mention them again about analyzing the building code issues, all the different building codes. You had lots of choices, and there's 3 of them out there, but what we can do, and my experience is the fire safety issues with the fire code is the one that always is the problem. And I would hope you could have a conversation with your fire chief about looking at systems that do the job, but aren't the Cadillacs. I mean, and there are levels in fire systems, and usually the argument is like, well, that does the job, but it's another $30,000, $40,000 a unit to do that because it's pressurized systems and such. So to the extent we can be more liberal on our interpretations. If we're going from a non-sprinkled building to a sprinkled building, that's a hell of an improvement in the first place. So we don't need to go to the Cadillac. And so I just want to put that out there as that conversation as you might want to have with the fire chief and the building official, because that's going to play a lot into the feasibility of this. I agree. Back to the citywide, as Mr. Cornell made the comment, the issue of why to go to citywide is we need more supply, and going citywide will give us more housing supply. So that's the rationale I have for that. Thank you for confirming that rooftop facilities would be helpful and can be done. And as to parking, back to the CBD, and this is something Commissioner Barnwell and myself continue to harp on, which is the idea of coming up with an understanding what parking you have, how we can operate our CBD parking as a system, how we can allow residential uses. We got these places that have 0 parking, and we have people that are underparked, and if somebody wants a car, we should be able to come up with a system that they can park in these city lots that are half at night or vacant, other than just a couple of them. We do have programs that allow for a couple of them to be used, but we might want to think about this as a very much more proactive approach to balance those on a sort of a 24-hour basis. And I know the folks in the transportation have probably been thinking about that. I'm not going to say that you haven't.
Every second of the day. So,
okay.
But yes, I could comment on a little bit later, but I realize we're in comments. But I do have some additional feedback for that if you so choose to hear it. If not, please continue with your comments.
I would take your comments now, honestly.
Well, let's start with a slide. I did have some backup slides to this presentation in case it came up, but we are thinking about a fully managed parking system in order for our downtown developments to be successful. Parking, period, needs to be managed, whether it's on street, in the parking lots, et cetera. That was the number one thing from our 2011 general plan as far as sort of moving the needle to reduce vehicle miles traveled, was to relook at the way we think of parking and looking at price parking and all of that. If you go to slide 60, this was just Commissioner Barnwell mentioned, well, we don't have any studies on anything. That we do, we're looking at this like at a regional level. I sit on the technical advisory board, both, actually all at the table, we're on the advisory boards at the regional level with respect to transportation and housing related issues. There was a report that was released, and again, I'm happy to provide a link, but it's on regional travel patterns for our entire county. It is really interesting, and this, again, it's like snapshots in time, and it's just overall with trends. But what I think is interesting is that as of right now, the study came out earlier this year, where it was adopted by the SBCAG board. But 5% of households do not own vehicles right now within the city of Santa Barbara. 28% are one-car families. And it's actually kind of interesting too, like as far as age distribution of who owns the no-car households. It's kind of in that 18 to 34 is a high spike, and of course over 65. And it's interesting too for the income levels where car ownership is, of course, like when you think of low-income households, a lot of the low-income households are low vehicle households as well. But the data also shows that it's sort of stratified as well. So we're monitoring for that, and again, we have this data source available through 2039. So we'll be constantly reviewing the data as our development trends go. If you go to slide 54, it just tells a little bit of the story. If you recall, well, some of the commissioners during the Cosmont study, that was done ahead of the whole State Street process, and it was really looking again at land use and economics. Commissioner Barnwell's absolutely right that land use and transportation is so heavily tied together. But this was one of the slides. So there's about 23,000 jobs just in the downtown area. And that accounts for, like, in our general area, that 40% of the jobs are downtown. So if we had to pick, like, adaptive reuse or areas, like the idea is to put people next to jobs and services. So our downtown area is very much a plug and play, not only for the jobs and housing connection, but of course other services too, related to health, related to parks, all of those types of things. So that's kind of a little bit on the background of, again, trying to locate people close to housing for that. If you go to slide 52, this is just, again, if you see number one, that's the area which is our central business district with the lowest vehicle miles traveled. Area 2 is the second lowest. So that, again, it's really following our grid system. As soon as you break from the grid, that's when you see the higher vehicle volumes. And so, again, it's trying to put closer to jobs in that, in housing, in the areas of 1 and 2. Makes the most sense. Once you go beyond those areas, not that there's tremendous with the AUD program and opportunity sites. There's definitely incentives outside of that, and that's that's great. And, but the freeway still remains such a huge barrier for getting around, for walking, from a perspective of walking, biking, and those types of things. So when we do that, and when you're considering the larger area, that's, again, we have to, as a team, food for thought. We understand the direction today to expand beyond this EBD. I just wanted to put a little bit of context with related to land use versus transportation. Again, this is just the high level, but we could dive into a little bit more type of thing. I think that's it so far that I can cover today. Thank you for the tangent. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for your constant efforts on this. I had one more comment, which is as to the requirement about active space on State Street. It's been my experience that you need to at least set a minimum depth, and that 35-foot depth is sort of what we would describe in the business as liner retail, but it does serve the purpose of activation. So if you were, I would not suggest you go to take that out. But the percentage thing, I understand, it could be a combination, but you need to at least keep this 35-foot depth. You don't want to overplay it, but at the same time, you don't want less than 35 feet, or it really will not be used for active retail type facilities. So that's just my experience. So with that, Commissioner Barnwell has his...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make one last comment, having listened to all of my fellow commissioners. The idea of putting this over the entire Title 30 is where we're all going. I had a policy wonk hat on when I was suggesting maybe a Milpas or a Haley Street corridor, but I think the idea that we're doing it, let's do it, right? Let's do the whole town. And so I concur with that idea that let's do the whole thing. Let's do it right, not have to come back at it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Busk, you've heard enough from us on this, and is there anything else you would like us to do at this point?
No, I think we have good feedback. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, with that, I'm going to move on our agenda, and we'll look forward to you to be back to us and with more on this soon in the new year. And thank you, Ms. Falcon, for your presentation. Commissioner Boss, we're on committee and liaison reports. Do you have a staff hearing officer liaison report?
For a staff hearing officer, I think yesterday it was just a couple of coastal development permits and enforcement abatements. So I don't have okay, walking away, okay. Anything else I missed, Mr. Golod? No, nothing okay, thank you.
Okay, other commissioners, any of you have any liaison reports you'd like to give at this time? It looks like everybody's been on break or something. Okay, so with that, I'm going to call the December 12th Planning Commission hearing adjourned at 3:41 p.m. Our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for Thursday, December 19th, 2024. Thank you all for being here, and have a great day.